It began with a 911 call that didn't sound quite right. At 9:47 p.m. on a chilly evening in late November, emergency dispatchers in suburban Ohio received a call from a man reporting that his wife had drowned in the bathtub. His voice was calm, too calm, as he explained that she must have slipped. But by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. 33-year-old Laura Bennett, a devoted teacher and soon-to-be mother, was gone. Her husband, Ethan Bennett, a 36-year-old nurse, sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly, his expression unreadable. To the casual observer, it looked like a tragic domestic accident. But to the seasoned first responders, something about the scene felt wrong: the faint scent of cleaning solution, the oddly dry bathroom floor, and the husband's distant demeanor. And before long, investigators would uncover a tangled web of deceit, obsession, and betrayal that would shake their quiet town to its core. Just 2 years earlier, Ethan and Laura had been the image of redemption. They met in church. Ethan was a charismatic former pastor who had stepped away from the ministry after what he called a crisis of faith. Laura, kind and deeply spiritual, believed she could help him find his way back. Within a year, they were married, a union everyone in their congregation admired. Together, they seemed destined for a peaceful life filled with service, love, and family. Ethan eventually retrained as a nurse, telling friends he wanted to keep helping people, even outside the pulpit. He found work at a local hospital, where he was well-liked, confident, attentive, and endlessly charming. But beneath that calm surface, Ethan was hiding something dark. At the hospital, he grew close to another nurse, Heather Collins, a younger colleague known for her quick wit and free spirit. Their friendship began innocently: long shifts, shared lunches, small jokes in the break room. But before long, the connection deepened into an affair. Ethan justified it to himself as temporary, something he would end once he and Laura worked through their issues. But secrets, once planted, tend to grow. Laura knew something was wrong long before she had proof. Ethan's late-night texts, his sudden need for extra shifts, the emotional distance. She tried to fix things: counseling, prayer, even weekend trips to rekindle their bond. When she found out she was pregnant, she hoped it would bring them closer. Ethan promised he'd change. He swore the affair was over. For a while, Laura believed him. But in truth, Ethan had never stopped seeing Heather. He simply got better at hiding it, deleting messages, using hospital computers instead of his phone, and finding reasons to visit Heather's apartment on his way home from work. To the outside world, the Bennetts were a happy couple preparing for their first child. Inside their home, tension simmered beneath forced smiles and polite conversation. Then came the first strange illness. One evening in early autumn, Laura returned from a doctor's appointment feeling lightheaded. She collapsed in the kitchen before Ethan could catch her. At the hospital, tests revealed traces of a sedative in her system, the kind used in clinical settings. Ethan, ever the caring husband, stayed by her side, insisting she must have accidentally mixed her prenatal vitamins with leftover medication from a dental procedure. The doctors accepted the explanation. Laura didn't. She began to suspect that someone, maybe even Ethan, was trying to harm her. Friends later recalled how she confided her fears in hushed tones over coffee, saying she didn't feel safe but couldn't prove why. They urged her to leave, but she stayed, convinced she could still save her marriage. Weeks later, she fell ill again, dizzy, disoriented, unable to stay awake. Once more, she tested positive for the same sedative. This time, the dose was higher. Ethan claimed it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even pregnancy complications. Yet despite his soothing tone, his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. The hospital released Laura after 2 days. She told her sister she planned to confront Ethan that weekend. But she never got the chance. Because 3 nights later, she was dead, found lifeless in a bathtub, her skin cold, her unborn child gone with her. And as detectives began their work, Ethan's story, calm, polished, rehearsed, started to fall apart. Detective Rachel Morgan had been with the county's major crimes unit for nearly 15 years, and she'd seen her share of tragedies. But something about the Bennett's case unsettled her. The scene didn't fit the husband's story. The bathroom, though spotless, smelled faintly of bleach, an odd choice for someone who claimed he'd just discovered his wife unresponsive. Laura's hair was damp but not dripping, and the towel Ethan said he'd used to pull her out of the tub was completely dry. There were faint bruises along her jawline, too symmetrical to be from a fall. When asked to describe what happened, Ethan spoke in long, deliberate sentences, as if reading from a script. She said she wanted to relax. I was in the kitchen, finishing some paperwork for the hospital. When I went to check on her, she was under the water. I pulled her out, called 911, and started CPR. That's all I know. His tone was steady, controlled. Too controlled. Detective Morgan had seen grief before, the shaking hands, the disbelief, the chaos that grief brings. But Ethan Bennett was composed, his eyes dry. He answered every question without hesitation, even offering to show her his phone to prove he had nothing to hide. It was the sort of gesture that looked cooperative on the surface, but to Morgan, it felt rehearsed. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. Laura's autopsy revealed no signs of trauma consistent with a slip or fall. The cause of death was ruled drowning, but the toxicology report uncovered a critical clue, traces of the same sedative that had appeared in her system during her previous hospital visits. The dosage was high enough to cause unconsciousness. Someone had drugged her. And that someone had access to medical-grade sedatives. Ethan's position at the hospital immediately came under scrutiny. Investigators discovered that he had routine access to midazolam, a fast-acting sedative used in emergency settings. When asked to account for missing vials, the hospital pharmacy log showed irregularities, subtle, but noticeable. A few vials logged out under his name had never been returned. The deeper detectives looked, the darker things became. Hospital IT staff uncovered that Ethan had used his work computer to search for information about the effects of sedatives, their half-lives, and how they interacted with water. He'd also disabled web monitoring tools that usually tracked staff internet use, a breach of policy that raised red flags. At home, his laptop told another story. Browser history showed searches for accidental bathtub deaths and how long before water masks overdose. There were also traces of deleted messages, romantic ones, between Ethan and Heather Collins, his colleague and mistress. When confronted with these findings, Ethan looked more tired than scared. "This is ridiculous," he said calmly during questioning. "I'm a nurse. I look up medications all the time. You're twisting everything because you want a villain." But Detective Morgan wasn't convinced. While investigators pieced together the evidence, those who had known Laura struggled to process her death. At her memorial service, the church was filled to capacity. Friends spoke about her kindness, her patience, her unwavering faith. Her sister, Megan, couldn't stop crying as she spoke to the crowd. She wanted to believe in people, even when they didn't deserve it. In the back pew, Ethan sat motionless, head bowed. To some, it looked like grief. To others, guilt. After the service, Megan approached him. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "She told me what you were doing," she said quietly. "She knew about the other woman." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not true. She said if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident." For the first time since his wife's death, Ethan's mask cracked. He stood abruptly, muttered something about not having to listen to wild accusations, and walked out. Detective Morgan, watching from the back, noted every detail, the clenched fists, the escape, the silence that followed him out the door. Within weeks, the case turned from a tragedy to a criminal investigation. Search warrants were executed at Ethan's home, car, and workplace. Investigators collected medication logs, security footage, and communication records. On his phone, they found a string of deleted messages from Heather Collins. "You promised this would be over soon. When can we finally stop sneaking around? You said she's been feeling sick. What did you do?" The last message, sent 2 days before Laura's death, simply read, "Don't do anything stupid." The following evening, Heather had texted again, no reply. By the time the investigators read those words, Laura had been dead for nearly 3 weeks. Detective Morgan closed the evidence folder slowly. She knew what the pieces pointed to: a man with motive, means, and opportunity. A husband whose double life had begun to crumble. But before she could make an arrest, she needed one final piece, something undeniable. And as it turned out, that piece was already sitting in the hospital's security archives, waiting to be found. The hospital's security office was quiet except for the hum of aging computers and the low murmur of Detective Rachel Morgan questioning the technician. "Pull everything from November 20th through the 24th, she said. "Every entrance, every storage area, every camera near the medication room." The technician, a thin man with tired eyes, nodded and started scrubbing through hours of footage. The grainy images flickered on the monitor, nurses moving through sterile halls, carts squeaking along linoleum floors, the mundane rhythm of hospital life. But then, just past midnight on November 22nd, 3 days before Laura's death, Ethan appeared. He wasn't on shift. The camera showed him swiping his badge to access the controlled medication room. He looked around, nervous, then stepped inside. When he emerged, his lab coat pocket bulged slightly. The technician froze the frame. "That's him, right?" Rachel nodded slowly. "That's him." The timestamp on the footage matched the period when the pharmacy logs showed missing sedatives. It was the final link. Ethan Bennett had accessed restricted medication after hours, with no authorization. That night, Detective Morgan drove home in silence, the glow of the streetlights flashing across her windshield. The case had moved beyond suspicion. Now it was only a matter of proving intent. 2 days later, the department obtained an arrest warrant. Ethan was taken into custody at the hospital during his morning shift. He didn't resist, only asked if he could make a call to his lawyer. When word spread, the hospital staff were stunned. Many had admired him, the kind, soft-spoken nurse who comforted patients and prayed with grieving families. His colleagues whispered in disbelief as officers escorted him out. Heather Collins, his lover, stood frozen in the hallway. She didn't cry, but her face went pale. She'd known something terrible was coming, she just hadn't expected it to arrive this soon. During interrogation, Ethan sat across from Detective Morgan in the gray-walled interview room. His posture was straight, his expression composed. "Ethan," Rachel began, her tone calm, "we have footage of you entering the medication room off-duty. We have missing vials logged under your name. And your wife died with that same drug in her system. You want to explain that?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I went in because a patient needed emergency medication. I forgot to sign it out properly. That's on me, not murder." "And the Google searches? The affair? The disabled filters on your hospital account?" He smirked faintly. "You're building a story, detective. But you don't have proof I killed anyone. Laura drowned. That's the official cause, right?" Rachel held his gaze. "She drowned because she couldn't wake up. Because someone made sure she wouldn't." Ethan's composure faltered for a split second, just enough for her to see the flicker of panic before the mask slipped back into place. When the questioning ended, he requested a lawyer and said nothing more. Heather Collins, meanwhile, was brought in for questioning as a potential witness. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "I never thought he'd actually do something," she whispered. "He told me they were separating. He said she was unstable. He said he just needed time to make it official. Rachel leaned forward. Did he ever talk about getting rid of her? Heather hesitated, then nodded slightly. He joked once, said if Laura wasn't around, things would be easier. I told him that wasn't funny. He laughed it off, but I don't think he was joking. She paused, eyes darting toward the door. The night before she died, he texted me, "Everything will be better soon." I didn't know what he meant until I saw the news. Her statement strengthened the prosecution's timeline. But Rachel could see the torment in Heather's face. She wasn't just a witness, she was another casualty of Ethan Bennett's web of lies. Ethan was charged with second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and illegal possession of controlled substances. His defense claimed it was all circumstantial, that he'd simply made a tragic mistake while trying to help his wife. They painted him as a man overwhelmed by stress, haunted by guilt, but not a killer. When the trial began 6 months later, the courtroom was filled every day. Reporters crowded the steps, broadcasting the fall of a man once admired for his compassion and faith. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision, the sedatives, the footage, the affair, and the chilling searches on his laptop. They called medical experts who testified that Laura's levels of sedative were far too high to be accidental. When Detective Morgan took the stand, she spoke calmly, every word measured. This was not negligence, she said firmly. This was deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing. Ethan, seated beside his attorney, stared straight ahead, expression blank. But the defense fought back hard. They argued that there was no direct evidence of administration, no syringe, no witness, no confession. They claimed Laura may have overdosed accidentally, confusing her medications. They portrayed Ethan as a heartbroken husband persecuted for a tragedy he didn't cause. And when Ethan finally testified in his own defense, his voice trembled just enough to seem human again. "I loved her," he said softly. "I would have done anything for her. But I couldn't save her that night. And now everyone thinks I'm a monster." The courtroom was silent. For the first time, Detective Morgan felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible, even slightly, that he hadn't meant to kill her? But then she remembered the bleach smell. The dry towel. The searches. The sedative. Ethan Bennett hadn't just been unlucky. He had planned everything. The courthouse in Franklin County was packed every morning of the trial. Locals filled every bench, eager for a glimpse of the man they once trusted, a nurse, a former pastor, now accused of ending his pregnant wife's life. Outside, camera crews clustered under gray skies as the story spread beyond Ohio. The prosecution called their case a quiet murder cloaked as mercy. They opened with the facts, 2 prior, mysterious illnesses, both showing traces of the same hospital sedative. Laura's fear, documented in messages to her sister. Ethan's access to restricted drugs. The deleted search history. The affair. It was all laid out in neat, methodical order, each detail another crack in the image of the grieving husband. Prosecutor James Carver, a composed man in his 50s, addressed the jury, this was not an accident. Ethan Bennett sedated his wife, twice before, unsuccessfully, and on the 3rd attempt, ensured she could not wake up. He waited, he cleaned, and he called for help only when it was too late. He let the words sink in before continuing. This case isn't just about one life lost. It's about trust, the kind of trust that turns deadly when placed in the wrong hands. Across the courtroom, Ethan sat expressionless, flanked by his attorney, Daniel Pierce, who had built a reputation for defending high-profile clients. Dressed in a navy suit, Ethan looked every bit the part of a man wronged by fate, calm, neatly groomed, eyes downcast in practiced sorrow. But when Heather Collins took the stand, that calm cracked. Heather's voice was quiet but clear. "I thought he was going to leave her," she said. "He told me he loved me, that once the baby came, it would ruin everything. He said Laura wouldn't stop fighting for their marriage. I told him to walk away. He said he couldn't. She paused, gripping the witness stand. The night before Laura died, he texted me, "Everything will be fine soon. You'll see." The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the faint clicking of reporters' keyboards. When the defense cross-examined her, Pierce was ruthless. "A mess. Collins," he said smoothly, "isn't it true you were jealous of Mrs. Bennett? That you wanted Ethan to yourself?" Heather hesitated. "I loved him, yes. But I didn't want this." Pierce pressed harder. "Did you ever threaten to tell Laura about the affair?" "I thought about it," she admitted. "But I never did." He nodded, feigning sympathy. "So you were angry when he wouldn't leave her?" "I was hurt," she corrected, her voice trembling. "Not angry." When she stepped down, Ethan avoided her gaze. The defense built their narrative carefully, not of a murderer, but of a man overwhelmed by guilt and circumstance. They argued that Laura's death had been a tragic accident, possibly caused by fatigue, pregnancy-related dizziness, or even a fainting spell in the bath. They claimed Ethan's suspicious searches were the actions of a medical professional curious about drug interactions, not a killer plotting his wife's death. Pierce's closing statement painted Ethan as a man haunted by personal failure but incapable of violence. "He loved his wife," Pierce said softly, pacing before the jury. "He sat with her through every doctor's appointment, every scare. Yes, he made mistakes, an affair, poor decisions, but that does not make him a murderer. The state wants to punish him not for proof, but for betrayal." He stopped, meeting the jurors' eyes. "Ask yourselves, do they have certainty, or just suspicion dressed up as science?" The jury deliberated for 3 days. Outside, reporters speculated endlessly. Inside, Detective Rachel Morgan waited, her nerves tight. She'd spent months building the case, but she knew juries were unpredictable. The defense had done well, too well, perhaps. When the verdict came, the courtroom felt suffocating. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreperson began, "We find the defendant not guilty." Gasps filled the room. Ethan's attorney exhaled sharply, clapping a hand on his client's shoulder. Ethan remained still, eyes closed, lips trembling just enough to suggest relief. Detective Morgan sat frozen. It wasn't disbelief, it was something colder. The evidence had been there, but the story hadn't convinced the jury. Laura's sister Megan broke down in tears. She left the courtroom before the judge could dismiss them, whispering, "He's going to get away with it." Outside, Ethan faced cameras with quiet restraint. "I'm thankful for justice," he said softly. "Laura's death was a tragedy, but I hope everyone can finally let her rest." He didn't mention the baby. For a time, it seemed over. Ethan resigned from the hospital, moved 2 towns away, and took work at a small clinic under a different name. Heather Collins left the state entirely. But Detective Morgan couldn't let it go. Something in her gut said it wasn't finished, and she was right. A year later, an internal audit at the hospital uncovered something new, a hidden folder in Ethan's old computer profile. Encrypted and nearly deleted, it contained detailed notes, dosage amounts, timing, even estimated absorption rates for sedatives in warm water. It was the blueprint of Laura's death. With the new evidence, prosecutors reopened the case. And this time, Ethan Bennett wouldn't walk away so easily. When the call came through, Detective Rachel Morgan was sitting in her car outside a diner, coffee growing cold in her hand. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," said the hospital's new IT director, his voice tight with urgency. "We found something in Bennett's old files. Something he tried to wipe." By that evening, she was back at the precinct, watching the data appear on screen, a hidden folder recovered from Ethan's hospital account, containing over a dozen documents. Each file was clinical in tone, coldly methodical. One read, 5 milligrams equals mild sedation. 10 milligrams equals loss of consciousness within 5 to 7 minutes. Add warm water, increased effect. Another listed timestamps and dosages that matched the nights of Laura's previous collapses. And in one final document, dated just 2 days before her death, Ethan had written, "Final attempt. Lower dose first, then finish in bath." Rachel exhaled slowly. Her instincts had been right all along. The accident was not an accident, it was a controlled, planned act. The prosecutor's office reopened the case within weeks, filing new charges: involuntary manslaughter, administration of a controlled substance, and evidence tampering. Though the original jury had acquitted him of murder, the new evidence allowed prosecutors to pursue separate counts tied to reckless homicide and drug misuse. This time, there would be no hiding behind charm or faith. Ethan Bennett was arrested quietly on a gray morning in early spring. Officers found him living under his middle name in a rented townhouse just outside Columbus. He answered the door wearing scrubs, still working as a nurse despite a suspended license. When he saw the warrant, he didn't resist, he simply nodded, as if he had expected it all along. At the station, Detective Morgan faced him again for the first time in almost 2 years. His hair was shorter now, flecked with gray, but his eyes were the same calm, unreadable shade of blue. "Looks like you missed me," he said, half smiling. She didn't return it. "You didn't expect to be found out?" He shrugged. "Everyone gets caught eventually. Doesn't mean they understand why." Rachel studied him for a long moment. "Then tell me. Why?" He leaned back in his chair, voice low. "Laura wanted a life that wasn't mine. I couldn't keep pretending. She wouldn't let go. I made it peaceful for her." The words sent a chill through the room, not just for what he said, but for how gently he said it. The retrial began in 2024, smaller this time, quieter. Many of the public had moved on, but for those who remembered, it reopened every wound. Laura's family sat in the front row again, holding hands, their faces pale but resolute. Ethan's new defense team tried to downplay the documents, claiming they were academic notes from his years of medical study. But prosecutors countered with expert testimony from digital analysts who confirmed that the files had been written during his employment, and referenced medications only available at his hospital. The jury listened to every word in silence. When Ethan took the stand again, his charm was gone. He appeared weary, hollowed out, still trying to justify his actions. "I didn't mean for her to die," he insisted. "She was already weak. I just wanted her to calm down." Prosecutor Carver pressed him sharply. "You drugged your wife, multiple times. You had every chance to call for help. Instead, you cleaned up and called 911 after she was gone. That's not care. That's control." Ethan's composure cracked. "You don't understand," he shouted. "She was ruining everything. I couldn't live that life anymore." The courtroom went still. The man once known for his poise had finally revealed what lay beneath: anger, resentment, and the twisted self-pity of someone who believed his suffering outweighed hers. Detective Morgan watched from the gallery, unmoving. She'd waited years to hear that slip, that confession disguised as justification. When the closing arguments ended, the jury took only 6 hours to reach a verdict. On the charge of involuntary manslaughter, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant, Ethan Bennett, guilty." Laura's sister Megan broke down in quiet sobs. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she still carried finally lift. Ethan showed no reaction, staring straight ahead as if the words meant nothing. But when the judge pronounced his sentence, 25 years in state prison, without eligibility for parole for at least 15, Ethan's face twitched, just once. The mask cracked, and for a flicker of a second, the man beneath the persona appeared, small, frightened, and utterly alone. Outside the courthouse, the air was brisk and bright. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashing. Detective Morgan walked past them without a word, heading down the courthouse steps. Justice, she knew, wasn't perfect, not when it came so late. But at least now, Laura's story had an ending. And somewhere deep down, Rachel hoped that meant the haunting would finally stop. Still, as she drove home through the fading afternoon light, one thought lingered. Men like Ethan Bennett never started as monsters. They started as charmers, the kind people trusted, admired, even loved. And sometimes, those were the most dangerous ones of all. Ethan Bennett's prison intake photograph appeared in every local newspaper the next morning. The man who had once preached about forgiveness and faith now stared into the camera with flat, cold eyes, no trace of remorse, no trace of the charm that had once drawn people in. Inmates at the Ohio State Correctional Facility recognized him immediately. Many had watched his trial on the news. The pastor nurse, they called him, half mocking, half curious. He kept to himself at first, declining chapel invitations and avoiding conversation. For a man who had once stood in a pulpit, he seemed allergic to prayer. According to guards' reports, Ethan spent most of his time in the library, reading medical journals and religious texts in equal measure. He rarely spoke, except to request extra paper for writing reflections. Some suspected he was drafting another sermon, but others whispered he was documenting his version of the story, determined to control the narrative even behind bars. He maintained the same calm exterior that had fooled so many before, but cracks began to show. One guard noticed how Ethan's hands shook whenever someone mentioned Laura's name. Another said he'd overheard Ethan muttering late at night, repeating phrases from his trial, "You don't understand, she wouldn't let go." It was guilt, or maybe obsession, the same quiet madness that had led him down the path of destruction. Outside the prison walls, life began to mend itself, piece by fragile piece. Laura's sister, Megan, started a foundation in her memory, a nonprofit focused on helping domestic abuse victims recognize subtle warning signs of coercive control and manipulation. She often spoke publicly about her sister's kindness, about how love can blind even the strongest among us. Her speeches drew quiet tears from survivors who saw themselves in Laura's story. "I don't want her remembered only as a victim," Megan said in one interview. She was hopeful. She believed people could change. But sometimes, the person you're praying for is the one who's already writing your ending. The foundation grew quickly, and within a year, the Laura Project became a statewide initiative, offering free counseling and workshops. For Megan, it wasn't just advocacy, it was redemption. Detective Rachel Morgan attended the launch event, sitting quietly in the back of the auditorium. When Megan spotted her afterward, she crossed the room and hugged her tightly. "You never gave up," Megan whispered. Rachel smiled faintly. Neither did she. Meanwhile, back in the small Ohio town where it had all begun, people still whispered about the Bennetts. Their old house stood empty for months, the property no one wanted. The cheerful yellow siding had faded, and weeds grew through cracks in the front path. Children passing by sometimes dared each other to peek inside, claiming the lights flickered at night. The town eventually sold it to a young couple who renovated it completely, painting the walls, changing the floors, replacing the tub. But for those who remembered, the address would always carry a chill. Neighbors still recalled how perfect Ethan and Laura had seemed, the smiling Christmas cards, the dinner parties, the gentle prayers before meals. They spoke about how quickly appearances could deceive. "I saw him helping an old lady with groceries once," one neighbor told a reporter. "He looked like the kind of man you'd trust with your life. Turns out, he was exactly the kind you shouldn't." Inside prison, Ethan filed an appeal almost immediately, arguing that the new evidence had been misinterpreted and that his rights were violated. His lawyers crafted long statements filled with religious undertones, repentance, redemption, divine misunderstanding. But the appellate court rejected the claim, stating bluntly that the evidence clearly established a deliberate pattern of drug administration resulting in death. The rejection broke something in him. Over the following months, guards noticed his demeanor shifting, the self-assured mask gone, replaced by restlessness and short temper. He started isolating himself even more, snapping at other inmates who tried to talk to him. One morning, during routine rounds, a guard found Ethan sitting alone at a library table, a half-finished letter in front of him. It read. They called it manslaughter, but they never understood. I gave her peace when no one else could. He never mailed it. The paper was confiscated, filed away as evidence of his continuing delusion. Detective Morgan read about it in the news, shaking her head. Even after conviction, Ethan couldn't see the truth, that his mercy was just control in disguise, that his love was possession dressed as devotion. It wasn't faith that drove him. It was pride, the kind that hides behind compassion until it turns lethal. Years would pass, and people would move on. But Rachel knew that some stories never fully closed. They linger, not because of the horror, but because of how ordinary the beginning seemed. Ethan Bennett hadn't started as a monster. He'd started as a man admired by all, until one quiet night, love, control, and faith became indistinguishable in his mind. And when he finally acted on that confusion, he destroyed everything he once claimed to cherish. Outside the prison gates, seasons changed, snow melting into spring, flowers pushing through the thawed earth. For the world, time moved forward. For Ethan Bennett, it stood still, locked forever in that final, terrible moment where control replaced compassion. And in the silence of his cell, he finally began to understand what it meant to be alone. 5 years had passed since the verdict that finally sealed Ethan Bennett's fate. Time had a way of softening the edges of tragedy, but for those closest to Laura, the loss never truly faded, it simply changed shape. Her sister Megan had remarried, moved to Cincinnati, and continued running the Laura Project. Under her guidance, the foundation had grown into one of the region's most respected advocacy networks. They funded safe housing, hosted counseling retreats, and partnered with law enforcement to train officers in identifying subtle forms of domestic coercion. Each year, on the anniversary of Laura's death, Megan lit a candle by her sister's framed photo, Laura smiling in a sunflower field, hair catching the sunlight, a joy frozen in time. I forgive you, Megan whispered once during the quiet ceremony. But I'll never forget what you took. That forgiveness wasn't for Ethan. It was for herself, a promise to live without the constant weight of bitterness. Detective Rachel Morgan, now nearing retirement, had earned commendations for her persistence on the Bennett case. Yet it remained the one file she kept separate from the rest, a worn brown folder she never stored away. Sometimes she would open it late at night, reread her notes, and wonder how many other Lauras had never been found in time. She'd learned a painful truth through this case: evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in the tone of comfort, wears a smile, and quotes scripture. Rachel was invited to speak at one of the Laura Project's annual awareness events. When she stepped onto the stage, she didn't read from her prepared notes. Instead, she spoke plainly. Laura Bennett believed she could love someone into changing, she said. But love isn't supposed to make you afraid. It's not meant to feel like walking on glass. If you ever find yourself explaining away someone's anger, their lies, their control, remember her story. Remember that help is out there. The crowd was silent. Then came a wave of applause, not loud, but sincere. Afterward, Megan found her backstage. They didn't need to say much. The shared silence between them said everything: grief, justice, closure, all bound together by quiet understanding. Inside the Ohio State Correctional Facility, Ethan Bennett's name had become little more than a passing reference. His behavior had grown erratic in recent years: sleepless nights, constant writing, conversations with people who weren't there. The once smooth talker now mumbled to himself about salvation and betrayal, scribbling letters he never sent. Inmates said he still believed he'd done the right thing. That Laura had been set free. The chaplain who visited him weekly once asked, "Do you ever think about what she felt, Ethan?" About what she went through in those last moments. Ethan looked up from his journal. She felt peace, he said quietly. Because I gave it to her. The chaplain left that day with a heavy heart. Some people, he thought, never find redemption because they never recognize the sin. By his 10th year behind bars, Ethan Bennett was a forgotten man, his letters returned unopened, his name erased from the church registry where he'd once preached. He faded into the background of the prison system, another inmate with a number instead of a legacy. In early spring, Megan received a letter from the Department of Corrections. Ethan had died of natural causes, a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed for years. She read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same drawer that held Laura's favorite necklace. When Detective Morgan heard the news, she didn't celebrate. She simply sighed, closing the folder she'd kept all those years. It's over, she said softly, though in her heart, she knew stories like this never really end. They echo, quietly, in every home where trust is misplaced, where silence hides behind the guise of love. That spring, the Laura Project planted a garden outside their new counseling center. Rows of sunflowers swayed gently in the breeze, bright, open, facing the light. Beneath a small bronze plaque were the engraved words. For those who stayed too long, and for those who finally found the strength to leave. Visitors often lingered there, survivors, families, or those who didn't yet realize they were living their own version of Laura's story. And every time Megan walked by, she smiled, imagining her sister somewhere warm, somewhere free, finally surrounded by the peace she had always wanted to give to others. In the end, the story of Ethan and Laura Bennett became more than a crime, it became a lesson written in pain and perseverance. A reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they sit across the dinner table, whispering I love you as they quietly take everything away. And that even after the darkest betrayal, truth has a way of finding the light, just as surely as sunflowers turn toward the sun.